The wind howls, rain lashes against your skin, and the night feels colder than ever. Suddenly, you see someone shivering, lost, completely alone. Would you stop to help? This is exactly what happened to a young woman who, without hesitation, took in a frail, elderly lady shivering in the rain. She had no idea that this simple act of kindness would lead to an extraordinary chain of events, one that would change her life forever. Have you ever had a moment where a simple act of kindness led to something you never expected? Maybe it changed someone's day or even their life. We'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your experiences. And if you believe in the power of kindness, hit the subscribe button and be part of a community that values compassion and change. Before we dive into this incredible story, have you ever been in a situation where a small act of kindness led to something unexpected? Share your experience in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of kindness, hit the subscribe button and be part of a community that values compassion and change. The wind howled through the streets of Chicago, rattling the windows of a tiny apartment on the city's south side. The neighborhood was a mix of small, aging homes and towering apartment buildings, a place where hardworking people struggled to make ends meet. Streetlights flickered, casting dim pools of light on sidewalks cracked from years of neglect. Despite the challenges, this community was full of resilience, where neighbors looked out for one another, even in the toughest times. The rain pelted against the glass, its relentless rhythm echoing the pounding in Samantha Davis's chest. Inside, under the dim glow of a flickering light, she sat at a worn wooden table, staring at a pile of overdue bills, her fingers running over the edges of the crumpled notices. Rent, utilities, and the most painful of all, medical expenses for her ailing mother. She had worked double shifts, skipped meals, and sacrificed every luxury, yet it was never enough. A sudden gust of wind sent a sharp creak through the walls, snapping Samantha out of her thoughts. She shivered, pulling her sweater tighter as she rose to close the loose window latch. The cold draft seeped through the gaps, and just as she reached for the latch, something outside caught her eye. Her breath hitched through the rain-streaked glass, barely illuminated by the dim glow of the street lamp. A lone figure huddled on her doorstep. An elderly woman, her silver hair clinging to her face, her frail body trembling against the cold. The sight of her fragile form, drenched and shivering, sent a pang through Samantha's chest. Without hesitation, she rushed to open the door. The icy rain hit her instantly, soaking through her already thin sweatshirt, but she barely noticed. "Ma'am, are you okay?" she called over the storm, raising her voice to be heard above the roaring wind. The elderly woman barely reacted, lifting her face just slightly, her eyes cloudy with confusion. She blinked as if trying to process Samantha's presence. This is my home," she murmured weakly, her voice barely louder than the storm. Samantha's brows furrowed. She glanced back at her apartment, then at the woman. That couldn't be right. She had lived here for years. There was no way this woman belonged to this building. But now wasn't the time for questions. The woman looked as if she might collapse at any moment, her thin frame barely holding itself together under the relentless force of the storm. A sharp gust of wind cut through the night, rattling the doorframe, sending another shiver through the elderly woman's fragile body. Samantha didn't hesitate any longer. Stepping forward, she carefully placed a steadying hand on the woman's shoulder. "Come inside, okay? You can't stay out here in this weather." For a moment, the elderly woman hesitated, her expression flickering with uncertainty. Her lips parted slightly as if trying to say something, but no words came. Then, as another powerful gust tore through the alley, she shrank further into herself, a helpless tremor overtaking her frame. She let out a weak, barely audible sigh and gave a slow, uncertain nod. Samantha hesitated for a brief moment, a flicker of uncertainty passing through her mind. What if this woman wasn't just lost? What if she had a family searching for her? Or worse, what if no one was? But as another gust of wind sent a violent shiver through the woman's frail frame, Samantha shook off her doubts. Wrapping an arm around her, she gently but firmly guided the woman inside, her muscles tensing against the frail weight pressing into her. As the doors swung shut behind them, the deafening roar of the storm was suddenly muted, replaced by the soft patter of raindrops slipping from their soaked clothes onto the hardwood floor. The elderly woman stood there, trembling, her drenched garments clinging to her frail body. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps, her shoulders still shaking from the cold. Samantha's heart clenched at the sight. This woman wasn't just lost, she was exhausted, vulnerable, alone. Without another thought, Samantha rushed to the closet, yanking out the only spare towel she had. She returned quickly, kneeling in front of the woman and gently patting down her wet hair and shoulders. "Let's get you warmed up," she murmured, her voice softer now, filled with quiet concern. "I'll find you something dry to wear." Still, the elderly woman didn't respond. Her gaze remained distant, unfocused, as if she were caught between the past and the present, unsure of where she truly belonged. Samantha swallowed hard. She had seen this before, the look of someone slipping away from reality. Shaking off the sinking weight in her chest, Samantha moved quickly, determined. She found an old sweater and a pair of sweatpants, probably too big, but warm nonetheless. She carefully helped the woman change, mindful of her delicate limbs, her fingers brushing against skin that felt almost paper-thin. Every movement was slow and gentle, a silent reassurance that she was safe here. Once the woman was dressed, Samantha guided her toward the small heater in the corner of the room, adjusting the dial to its highest setting. The orange glow cast flickering shadows across the walls, filling the space with a warmth that seemed to fight against the chill still clinging to the air. She wrapped a thick blanket around the woman's shoulders, watching as she instinctively pulled it tighter, her fingers curling into the fabric as if she were holding onto something tangible, something real. Samantha took a step back, studying the woman's face. There was something heartbreaking about the way she sat there, eyes distant, staring blankly at the heater as if trying to recall a memory just out of reach. Was she reliving a moment from her past, trying to place herself in a life she could no longer remember? The storm continued to rage outside, wind rattling against the window pane, but inside, a heavy silence settled over the small apartment. Samantha exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She had done the right thing, she knew that. But as she looked at the frail woman, lost in the fog of her own mind, she couldn't shake the question lingering in the back of her mind. Who was this woman, and where did she belong? Rushing to the closet, she grabbed the only spare towel she had, returning quickly to gently pat down the woman's drenched hair and shoulders. "Let's get you warmed up," she murmured, her voice softer now, tinged with concern. "I'll find you something dry to wear." The elderly woman blinked at her, still lost in whatever fog filled her mind. Samantha could see it clearly now, the vacant look in her eyes, the way she struggled to grasp her surroundings. She had seen this before. It was the same fear that haunted Samantha when she thought of her own mother, the thought that one day she too might not recognize where she was. Pushing the thought aside, she moved quickly. She found an old sweater and a pair of sweatpants, probably too big, but warm nonetheless. She helped the woman change, careful with her fragile limbs, then guided her toward the small heater in the corner of the room. "You must be hungry," Samantha murmured, mostly to herself. She turned toward the tiny kitchen, scanning the nearly empty shelves. There wasn't much left, just a little rice, a couple of eggs, and a few vegetables she had been saving for the rest of the week. But she couldn't let the woman go hungry, not after all she had been through. As she began cooking, the warm aroma of food filled the tiny apartment, pushing back the chill of the storm outside. When she finally placed a steaming bowl of rice porridge in front of the woman, her lips quivered slightly. "Thank you, dear," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Samantha swallowed against the lump in her throat. "You don't have to thank me." She watched as the woman took slow, careful bites, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the spoon. The minutes stretched on, the storm still raging outside, but inside, in this tiny apartment, there was warmth. As Samantha sat across from her, watching to make sure she ate enough, a single thought settled in her mind with absolute certainty: tomorrow, she would take the woman to the police. But no matter what happened, she would not let her be alone. Samantha glanced back at her apartment. That couldn't be right. But now wasn't the time for questions. The woman was on the verge of collapse. She gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Come inside, okay? You can't stay out here in this weather." The elderly woman hesitated, but as another gust of wind hit, she gave a small, uncertain nod. Samantha wrapped an arm around her and helped her inside, shutting out the storm behind them. The woman shivered uncontrollably, her wet clothes clinging to her frail frame. Samantha rushed to grab a towel, gently patting down the woman's drenched hair and shoulders. "Let's get you warmed up," she murmured. "I'll find you something dry to wear." As she helped the woman change into an old sweater and sweatpants, Samantha noticed the vacant look in her eyes. She recognized that look. It was the same one she feared seeing in her own mother someday. After preparing a simple bowl of warm rice porridge with the last of her groceries, Samantha placed it in front of the woman, who took slow, careful bites. "Thank you, dear," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Samantha swallowed past the lump in her throat. "You don't have to thank me." She knew she couldn't keep the woman indefinitely, but she also knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't let her be alone. By morning, the storm had passed, but the cold lingered. The woman, who had introduced herself as Margaret in a fleeting moment of clarity, stared out the window, her expression distant. Samantha knew what she had to do. "Margaret, we're going to the police station, okay? They might be able to help find your family." The elderly woman blinked, as if trying to process the words, then simply nodded. At the station, Samantha approached the front desk. "Excuse me, I found this woman outside my apartment last night. She's lost and doesn't remember where she lives. Can you check if anyone's reported her missing?" The officer typed into his computer, then shook his head. No reports matching her description. Samantha frowned. "That's it? That's all you're going to do?" The officer sighed. "Look, we'll keep her information on file, but we don't have the resources to house every lost elderly person in the city. If you're that concerned, you can take care of her yourself." Samantha clenched her jaw in frustration. Was this really how the world worked? She glanced at Margaret, who stood quietly beside her, completely unaware of how easily she could be abandoned. Samantha made her decision. "Fine, I will." Bringing Margaret to work with her was not ideal, but Samantha had no other choice. The cafe was already bustling when she arrived, the air filled with the scent of fresh coffee and pastries. She guided Margaret to a small table in the corner. "Just sit here, okay? If you need anything, wave at me." Margaret nodded absently, her fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. Samantha stole glances at her between customers, making sure she was okay. But she wasn't the only one watching. "Samantha!" A sharp voice snapped. It was her manager, Lisa, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. "That old woman has been sitting here all day. What has she ordered? A single glass of water? A piece of bread? Do you think this is a charity?" Samantha's stomach twisted, but she kept her voice calm. "I paid for her food. She's not bothering anyone." Lisa scoffed. "Customers don't want to see some sad, old woman loitering in the corner. It makes this place look like a shelter." Samantha's hands clenched into fists, but she refused to back down. She has nowhere else to go. Lisa stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Samantha, this isn't a shelter, and we have an image to maintain. I understand wanting to help, but bringing her here like this isn't appropriate. It's not fair to the business or the paying customers." Samantha inhaled sharply. She had spent her life swallowing her anger, picking her battles, but this was different. She lifted her chin. "Don't talk about her like that." Lisa blinked, caught off guard, but she quickly recovered. "Well, I guess that makes this easier. You're fired." The words landed like a slap, but Samantha barely registered them. What hurt more was the way Margaret flinched, curling in on herself as if she had been scolded for simply existing. Before Samantha could respond, the cafe door swung open. A tall man, James Sinclair, strode in, his expensive suit and sharp gaze radiating authority. but his expression softened the moment his eyes landed on Margaret. "Mom." Margaret's head lifted at the sound of his voice. For a moment, her cloudy eyes flickered with recognition. "James." He crossed the room in an instant, kneeling beside her. "I've been looking for you everywhere." Samantha stood frozen, watching the raw emotion on his face. Then James turned his attention to her. "You're the one who took care of her." Samantha shifted uncomfortably. "I just couldn't leave her alone." James studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, then slowly turned his gaze toward Lisa. The air in the cafe seemed to shift, the usual hum of conversations and clinking dishes dulling as people took notice of the tension. Lisa's confident posture wavered, her arms tightening around her chest as she instinctively took a half-step back. She was just about to leave, Samantha blurted before she could stop herself, her voice steady but carrying an edge. Lisa opened her mouth as if to argue, but James' sharp gaze froze her in place. His silence was more commanding than words, an authority that left no room for excuses. The weight of his presence made the power dynamics of the room clear. Lisa was no longer in control. With a forced swallow, she turned her head slightly, her shoulders stiff as if bracing for the inevitable consequences of her actions. Lisa stiffened. James didn't even acknowledge her. Instead, he turned back to Samantha. "Come with me. Let's talk." By the time they sat across from each other in an upscale restaurant, Samantha had learned who James really was, a self-made millionaire, founder of one of the country's fastest-growing specialty coffee brands, built on ethical sourcing and direct trade with farmers. His name carried weight in the business world, his company a leader in an industry that valued sustainability and quality. And yet, in that moment, he wasn't a CEO, he was just a son who had almost lost his mother. "You saved my mom," he said, his voice quieter now, filled with something deeper than gratitude. "I don't believe in repaying kindness with just words." He slid a check across the table, enough to wipe out her mother's medical debt. Samantha's breath caught in her throat, her fingers trembling as she reached for it, barely daring to believe what she was seeing. A lump formed in her throat as the weight of the moment settled on her. Her pulse pounded in her ears, a mix of shock, gratitude, and disbelief washing over her in waves. She had spent so many sleepless nights wondering how she would keep going, and now, in a single moment, everything could change. But that wasn't all. James leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "I don't just want to help you with this. I see potential in you, Samantha. I want you to train with my company, learn the business, grow into a leadership role. People like you, people with heart, are the kind of people I want on my team." Samantha's hands trembled. She had spent so long simply trying to survive that she had never dared to dream beyond the next paycheck. Could she really accept something like this? Could she belong in a world so different from her own? I don't know what to say," she finally whispered, barely able to find her voice. James gave her a reassuring nod. "Then just say yes." For a long moment, Samantha stared down at the check, at the opportunity in front of her. It wasn't just about money. It was a future, a chance to rebuild her life not just for herself, but for her mother, for everything she had fought through to get here. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She had a future. Has an act of kindness ever changed your life or the life of someone you know? Maybe a stranger's generosity helped you through a difficult time, or perhaps a small gesture of compassion made a lasting impact. We'd love to hear your story. Share in the comments. And let's create a space where kindness is celebrated and remembered. Your experience could inspire someone who needs a reminder that goodness still exists in the world. If this story moved you, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay connected with more uplifting stories that prove the power of humanity and generosity. Lessons from Samantha's story: the power of kindness and opportunity. The story of Samantha and Margaret teaches us valuable lessons about humanity, resilience, and the unexpected rewards of compassion. Here are some key takeaways from this heartwarming journey. Kindness has ripple effects. Samantha's simple act of helping a lost elderly woman in the rain set off a chain of events she could never have predicted. A small gesture of care can have far-reaching consequences, touching lives in ways we never anticipate. Doing the right thing isn't always easy. When Samantha stood up for Margaret, she faced resistance from her boss and even lost her job. This highlights a crucial lesson. Standing up for what's right often comes at a cost, but integrity and kindness will always lead to something greater. Human dignity should never be conditional. Lisa, the cafe manager, saw Margaret as an inconvenience rather than a person in need. This serves as a reminder that true compassion means recognizing and valuing every person's dignity, regardless of their circumstances. Opportunities come to those who lead with heart. James Sinclair saw in Samantha something beyond her circumstances. He saw strength, compassion, and leadership. Her willingness to help others not only changed Margaret's life, but also gave her the opportunity to build a new future for herself. You never know who you're helping. Margaret turned out to be the mother of a wealthy businessman, but Samantha didn't know that when she extended her kindness. This teaches us to help not because we expect something in return, but because it's the right thing to do. A personal reflection. This story isn't just about one act of kindness, it's about the way we treat others in our daily lives. We often rush past people in need, assuming their struggles are not our problem. But what if we took a moment to extend a hand? What if our small action could change the course of someone's life? Samantha's story reminds us that in a world where selfishness often prevails, choosing kindness makes all the difference. It's not about grand gestures, but about having the courage to care when no one else will. Join the movement of compassion. At Toch Story, we believe that every act of kindness, no matter how small, has the power to transform lives. If you were inspired by this story, help us spread messages of hope and humanity. Like this video to support more inspiring content. Share your own story of kindness in the comments below. Your experience may inspire someone else. Subscribe to Toch Story and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that moves your heart. Together, let's build a community that values compassion, courage, and the power of human connection.